Thank you, Albert, and thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to this conference this afternoon. I will try and be as brief as possible, given that we've started slightly late. The paper that I'm going to present is a co-authored piece. It's joint work with David Shapiro of Pennsylvania State University, who is sat in the audience and maybe answer the difficult questions at the end. What I want to talk about is three things, really. I want to make some comments about where the fertility transition is at present on a global scale, and in particular about the prospects for what we might call the end of the fertility transition, the closing stages of the fertility transition. There is a view that we are approaching the end of the fertility transition. In fact, there was a publication of the United Nations a few years ago called Completing the Fertility Transition. And so we'll make a few comments about where we stand in relation to the global fertility transition. And then I want to talk a little bit about what we have described as the Laggards, 7 countries which have not yet experienced fertility transition at all, or only to a very limited extent. And they're listed there: Chad, Democratic Republic of the Congo, Equatorial Guinea, the Gambia, Mali, Niger and Somalia. They're all in sub-Saharan Africa. But even compared with sub-Saharan Africa, which is the last region of the world to undergo the fertility transition, these countries have made very little progress. I want to look at their characteristics. Are these countries different in some way from other countries, or are they simply at one extreme of a continuum? In other words, do these countries' lack of progress, does it cause us to rethink the general models of the fertility transition that we have or not? And finally, I want to make a few comments about prospects for fertility decline in these countries. Many of you will know the fertility transition started in France in the 1790s, and 200 years on it is still incomplete. The global fertility transition has taken, or is taking, a very long time. If we look at the regions of the global south, Latin America, Asia and sub-Saharan Africa, we can define a point at which the fertility transition appears to have started in these countries. In most countries, fertility rises before it falls during the transition. And this graph shows the timing of the peak of fertility in world regions. We've got on the horizontal axis quinquennia, and on the vertical axis bars showing the percentage of each region's population which reached peak fertility in each quinquennium. And what you can see is that in Latin America, this happened in the 1950s, in Asia in the 1960s, and in sub-Saharan Africa not generally until the 1980s. What's not always acknowledged is that the rate of fertility decline, the pace of decline of fertility, has differed in these regions. We look at the fertility decline since the start of the transition, looking at the percentage by which fertility has declined in different periods since the start of the transition. We can see that in Asia and in Latin America, within about 35 years of the start of the transition, fertility had dropped by 50%. If we take sub-Saharan Africa, then within 35 years, it had only dropped by about a quarter. So there are differences in the pace of the fertility transition. And sub-Saharan Africa has a slower transition than other areas. In fact, the decline of fertility in sub-Saharan Africa has varied over time. And if we take this slide shows the total fertility rates in sub-Saharan African countries from about the late 1980s to about 2016. And these are population-weighted averages from demographic and health surveys, from all the demographic and health surveys which have been conducted in sub-Saharan Africa. And what you see here is that there was a slowing down of the decline in the period from about 1996 to about 2008, and it seems to have accelerated since then. And one possible reason for that is that during this period, resources were diverted from family planning program efforts into such things as HIV prevention and other things. Let's move on to the laggards. The 7 countries that are the last in the world to start the fertility transition. And we identify these countries either by noting that fertility has yet to decline by 10% since its peak. This 10% threshold is very frequently used to identify the start of the fertility transition in a country, since once fertility has gone down by 10% from the peak, the evidence is it doesn't normally rise back up again. In 2 countries then, Democratic Republic of the Congo and Niger, fertility has yet to decline by 10%. In 5 other countries, it declined from its peak only in 2010-2015. And those are the countries. 3 of them are contiguous south of the Sahara: Somalia, Democratic Republic of the Congo, Equatorial Guinea further south, and the Gambia is in the west. Some of them are very small countries, Equatorial Guinea and the Gambia. Others are a reasonable size, the 3 Sahelian countries. The Democratic Republic of the Congo is a large country with a large population. Here are some figures showing the total fertility rates in these countries. Looking at the peak fertility rate in the 3rd column, and looking at the rate in 2010 to 15 in the 2nd column. Just showing how fertility has fallen rather little from its peak, but also showing that there was a rise before the peak. We look at the fertility in 1950 to 1955. And we can bring that up to date. If we take the World Population Data Sheet from 2018, we can see that in these 7 countries, there really hasn't been very much decline since the first half of this decade. And indeed, in Chad, the estimates show a slight increase. There's a caveat here, because I don't actually know where the World Population Data Sheet's estimates come from, and there is a possibility they're just estimates or guesses based upon past data, and so they're not independent estimates. Nevertheless, there doesn't seem to be, if you take these estimates, there doesn't seem to be further progress. And this graph simply shows the laggard countries' fertility history compared with sub-Saharan Africa as a whole, the pale green line, and the less developed countries as a whole, the pink line at the bottom. What are the characteristics of these countries? Do they differ in some way from other countries in sub-Saharan Africa or from other countries in the developing world? The answer is they do, but not in such a way as you might regard them as a different type of country. So if we look at mean years of schooling for women, the laggard countries have lower schooling. If we look at the percentages of women with no education, they have much higher percentages compared with sub-Saharan Africa as a whole. They have higher infant mortality. They have a higher mean ideal number of children. They have lower gross domestic product per head, which is growing more slowly than other African countries. They have a lower median age of first marriage. They have a low percentage using modern contraception. They do. They differ. They have exactly the kinds of characteristics you would expect them to have if, given what we know about the factors driving fertility transition. They also have a relatively high percentage Muslim, most of them, although I think care is needed in the interpretation of this. For example, the Democratic Republic of the Congo doesn't have a large Muslim population. Some, but not all, have a history of conflict. No systematic relations. We can't say these are countries where there's been conflict, and other countries not. So, these laggard countries, the countries which are the bringing up the rear in the fertility transition, the countries where fertility, once it declines, will mean the fertility transition is complete. They're not a different category of country. They each have a combination of characteristics which is unfavourable to fertility decline. The prospects for fertility decline in these 7 countries, based upon the combinations of demographic and socio-economic covariates, actually don't look that good. Fertility decline is very slow, and it continues to be slow. It's slower in sub-Saharan Africa than elsewhere in the developing world, and it's slower in these countries than in sub-Saharan Africa. So, what does this mean for the future? Well, it suggests to me that the end of the fertility transition is some way off. And not only are these countries likely to have fertility rates of 4, 5 and 6 for several decades, but we've just looked at the country level so far. Many other countries have what we might call laggard regions, the most obvious of which is the northeast and northwest of Nigeria, which still have TFRs of well over 6 at the latest DHS. And these are large populations in northeast and northwest Nigeria. And so studying these regions is important because as a contribution to future population growth, they are likely to make a large contribution to the future population growth, both in Africa and globally. Thank you very much for listening.